It's great to be joined today by Glen Weyl, who's the principal researcher at Microsoft Research New England, and along with Eric Posner, the co-author of the new book, Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. And maybe we'll start, Glenn, with the For a Just Society. I mean, as you approached the writing of this book, what were the unjust elements of society that were kind of like the framework for what you wrote?
Well, I think that there's several things that are going wrong in our society. One is the fact that we have this enormous and growing inequality, so much of the wealth going to so few people who don't really make contributions that merit such a disproportional share of the social wealth. Another huge problem is the way that our economy is stagnating and people have fewer choices, less freedom, less opportunities. Today, many people feel than their parents had. And finally, maybe most importantly, our society seems to be rife with areas where minorities are being oppressed by majorities, and we don't have a really good way to resolve that problem. We sometimes have judges try to protect one group, but that ends up leading to all sorts of political dissatisfaction and conflict. So, on all these levels, our society really seems to be not responding to the demands of citizens, and that's what we're trying to address here.
One of the areas maybe we can choose to dive in here is your second chapter in the book called Radical Democracy, where you talk about a system of quadratic voting, which I find super interesting. What is a sort of layman's term explanation of what quadratic voting is?
Well, the basic problem, as I mentioned, that we're trying to address is that minorities are usually protected in our current system by the will of judges, but judges aren't really democratically elected and aren't really accountable to the public. On the other hand, majority rule wouldn't really work because you think about an issue like gay marriage, that it wouldn't be fair to have everyone have exactly one vote on that issue. So the question is, how do we resolve this? Quadratic voting is a solution where every citizen would have an equal number of votes, but they wouldn't have to spend all of those votes all on just one vote per issue or per election. If an issue is more important to someone, if someone knew more about an issue, they could choose to spend more of their vote credits on that issue. And people could get a lot of votes on the issues most important, less votes on the issues less important to them. And there's this little twist, which is that because you don't want everyone to spend all their votes on the one issue that they care most about, you actually get more votes the more evenly you spread your votes. So the cost of votes in units of these credits is the square of the number of votes that you get.
So, in other words, if you choose to support four different initiatives rather than one, you would not end up having four times the number of votes, but I guess would it be 16? Or I guess I'm not exactly sure I'm
It,
visualizing the math right.
it depends. It depends exactly on it. But here's an example. If you have 100 credits and there are 10 issues, we actually ran a survey like this. If you put all your credits on one issue, you'd get 10 votes on that issue because 10 is the square root of 100. But if you put equal numbers of votes on all the issues, you'd get roughly 3 or 4 votes on every issue. So that's like 30 votes. So you see, by spreading things out more equally, you get almost 3 times as much total influence, but in a more diffuse way across issues.
So, in preparing for the interview, I read critiques of some of your ideas, and the one that seemed to come up often with the quadratic voting is the idea that this fundamentally violates one person, one vote, and that idea. But I know that that's an issue that you address. So how do you address that issue?
Well, so the question is, what do we value about one person, one vote? Is it the rigidity that every person has to have exactly one vote on every issue? Or is it the fact that we all should be equals politically? I actually think that if it's the latter, which is what I think we should care about, then quadratic voting is actually more true to that principle. Because you think about minorities, if you're, say an African American living in the inner city in the United States, you don't have equality just because you have the same one person, one vote on every issue. You might get gerrymandered, and even beyond that, you're a minority, and so you're going to lose on a whole variety of issues where majorities can rule. It's much more consistent with the principle of equality that each of us gets an equal total amount of voice, but that we can choose to concentrate that voice on issues that are most important to us so that we have greater freedom to push for the things that really matter and really affect our interests.
I'm curious whether quadratic voting and some of the other ideas in the book, which we can get into as well, in your mind, is sort of the underlying philosophy a sort of utilitarianism where you're sort of measuring outcomes, and whether we call it marginal utility to society or the economy, I don't really know. But in reading it, my thought was that there's a very utilitarian underpinning, although it's sort of like a social utilitarianism of some kind, or am I just way off?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people have that perception, and certainly utilitarianism and that sort of thinking was one way that we helped, that helped us come up with these ideas. But I wouldn't say that I'm a utilitarian or that the book relies on you being a utilitarian, because we approach things from many different perspectives. I mean, some people are utilitarians, some people care about inequality for its own sake, some people care about not having oppressive authorities that dominate people, but not so much about utility exactly. Our book helps advance all of those goals, and we try to argue for it from all those different perspectives. There's something in religion that's called syncretism, which is that many different people might all worship the same God, but they view different aspects of it. And this book is written very much in that spirit. We don't want to take too strong of a stand on whether it's utilitarianism or autonomy or liberty or things like this, because we believe that these ideas can help improve along all those dimensions. And we aren't going to resolve, philosophical or religious disputes in a book like this. What we're instead going to do is propose new ways of organizing our society to advance values that many of us share.
Some of the ideas seem at first glance more difficult pragmatically to even think about how they might be implemented. In your
Yeah.
first chapter, you talk about a common ownership self-assessed tax, which we could talk about in more detail potentially. You also talk about ways of uniting the world's workers with a visa system where individuals would be able to sponsor visas for people from other countries. Which of these, I'm curious, do you think would be the most, and I know this is not your focus, but which would be the most pragmatically viable if you had to choose one where we could most approximate change the soonest? Is there one?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that what I would say is it depends a lot on whether you mean implement the full extent of the proposal, or where can we make the most near-term progress in
I'd say
getting
near-term
towards a better
progress.
society. Yeah, so the data is labor chapter, in which we argue that people should be able to receive compensation for the contributions that they make to the machine learning and artificial intelligence systems of companies like Google and Facebook, rather than just having that data be taken from them, is probably the most palatable and widely appreciated of the ideas, and probably the one that will get off the ground, at a broad scale, the quickest.
So the idea would be all of the data, all of your activity that's taking place on platforms, which could be the Google universe, the Facebook universe, could be any of these, that you would somehow, as a contributor of your data to that ecosystem, be compensated. Along what lines? Are we talking about literally financial compensation?
Yeah, eventually, absolutely. And, we imagine building what we call a data labor movement. Once people wake up, get, quote, cyber woke, to the value that their data is creating in this digital economy, and the way that the AI systems that are supposed to replace our jobs are actually based on all of our contributions, people will start demanding payment through sort of labor unions of a new modern digital sort. And fair terms of both use and compensation can be negotiated that way.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's often the idea that, listen, Facebook ads don't work on me in the sense that I haven't ever bought anything, which let's assume that that's true, although it can sometimes be hard to figure out exactly why you did buy something at some point in your life. So I'm of no value. So I just don't really care about this. But the truth is that the algorithm with which successful targets of a product or surface were targeted was data that did come from you, and thus it does have some economic value, even if you're not actually buying stuff.
Yeah, and it's not just the targeting of ads. I mean, that's what we're all familiar with today. But going forward, the greatest value these companies are going to create is not from advertising, really. Instead, it's from the artificial intelligence systems that they're training on our data and that they'll sell to companies to automate. For example, I don't know if you saw Google's recent new assistant,
Yeah.
the process of making reservations for someone. So they're going to automate that, and they're training all that based on our data. So people are going to be losing their jobs, and no one's going to be getting a new job, even though all that system relies on input that we put in.
The book is fascinating. It's called Radical Markets: Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. Glenn, thanks so much for talking to me about this today.
Thanks a lot, David.